All right, good afternoon, welcome. I'd like to just start by welcoming our special guest, Tom Linzey. Delighted to welcome you into the Sustainable Living Center, Tom. We've been here for 15 months. As you've already seen, we've got net zero energy, we've got our own rainwater harvesting, we've got mud earth walls taken from the local parking lot, we've got daylighting features, we've got every table is made of one of the local trees, and they're kind of all labelled, and we've got all natural products in the building to conform with the biobiology certification. We're going for LEED Platinum, and we're actually going for the Cascadia Living Building Challenge here. So this is a sort of uniquely challenging building, and I think that it's appropriate that a uniquely challenging individual should to come and give a talk here. Tom's a lawyer by training. He trained in Pennsylvania and 17 years ago launched the Community Environmental Defense Fund. And this is an organisation which obviously Tom will give you more detail on, but essentially is seeking to completely revise the legal structure of society right up to the Constitution in order to make sustainability fully enshrined in the rights of this country and other countries around the world. He's consulted, he and his team have consulted with over 500 communities around the United States. They're actively working with about, I think, 170 at the minute, with all sorts of fascinating legal strategies going on to keep the military-industrial complex at bay and hopefully in the long run defeat their pernicious activities. Also particularly noteworthy is Tom's work with the Ecuadorian government, where he and his team helped the government write a new constitutional element which it enshrines the rights of nature in the Constitution of Ecuador to protect things like the rainforest from oil exploitation and so forth. So Tom's giving the talk tonight in Dalby. I recommend you all come, but we've got this extra opportunity to meet and talk with him. So really great that you're able to spend this afternoon with this class. We've got till about 2:45, and then you've got a radio interview and we'll be doing a group meditation. So, welcome.
So I've always hated to be lectured to, and so I'm going to try to limit my comments to a little bit of an introduction. Tonight we're going to go full-blown, as one of my colleagues likes to say, grab onto your stuff, we're going over the wall. That's going to be tonight, talking about the details of some of what we do. But I wanted to talk today briefly, and then maybe have a conversation, discussion, Q&A, that kind of thing, about what needs to happen in this country, and in essence what needs to happen in every country, to actually put us on a path to sustainability. Because right now it's pretty clear to us, at least, that we're running in the opposite direction. And there's a reason for that, and it's structural in this country. It actually goes back to the Constitution, goes back to English common law, goes back to the 1400s, 1200s, all that kind of stuff, which we teach in different realms. I wanted to start today by getting some of the depressing stuff out of the way. And there's a lot of depressing stuff out there. And in fact, I spoke recently to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference in Eugene, Oregon. And I've gotten really tired of talking to conferences of lawyers, which is why I don't do it anymore. Because lawyers are trained to think in a certain way, and none of it's very helpful to the situation that we find ourselves in. And so I declined their invitation to speak at the conference first. And then the students came back and said, well, we want you to speak. And I said, well, people are going to get pissed off. And they said, we don't care, we want you to do it anyway. I said, okay. And so I opened it up by saying, we're fucked, right? I mean, we're cooked. Your generation knows it more than others, but we're pretty cooked right now. And so these numbers, which I used at the Environmental Law Conference, 570 billion. We produce and dispose of 570 billion pounds of municipal waste in this country each year. So 570 billion pounds. Where does that go? Well, it goes to landfills, it gets consumed in incinerators, it basically gets released to the environment in some way. So 570 billion pounds of waste. Of the 570 billion, 4 billion pounds are actually toxic waste. So hazardous waste, toxic waste stuff, the nasties, what we call them. So 4 billion pounds annually just in the United States. This isn't globally, this is just the United States, produced here in this country. The 2 trillion is pounds of livestock waste that's produced in this country. And most of the livestock waste is now produced by these vertically integrated concentrated animal feeding operations. So this corporatization of agriculture which has taken place produces large amounts of concentrated waste. So instead of before where we had decentralized farm communities, where the manure and the waste was actually integrated into the production process, today we have 2 trillion pounds of mostly liquid manure that's being produced by these vertically integrated corporatized facilities, which are then being trucked into other communities to actually be disposed of in conventional ways rather than being integrated into the process. This 11 million within 1 mile, 11 million people in the United States currently live within 1 mile of a Superfund site. So a federal Superfund site, 11 million people in this country currently live within 1 mile of a Superfund site. I, in all my naivete, some of which is still left, we've spent quite a bit of time in Alaska over the, yeah.
What's a Superfund site?
It's under the federal law, the federal government can designate certain toxic sites for cleanup. So these are hazardous sites, toxic chemicals, those types of things, and that people live within 1 mile of them where there could be health impacts from those facilities. So when we say Superfund, we mean the nastiest of the nasty sites, like PCB sites, those types of things. Like I said, in our naivete, we spent quite a bit of time in Alaska. I used to think Alaska was pristine. Because we think of Alaska, I'm going to run away to Alaska, and it's pristine. Well, Alaska has one of the highest rates of Superfund sites, mostly because of military activity in Alaska. But it's a scarred landscape as well. So even these places that we think of as being pristine are not pristine. The next number, 80,000. There are 80,000 industrial chemicals in use in the United States today. 80,000 industrial chemicals, many of which are synthetic. So you have corporations actually pumping out synthetic chemicals in their labs at the rate of 1,800 a year. So 1,800 new chemicals are being pumped into the ethosphere each year, adding to that total of 80,000. How many are found within your body? Well, the average human body now contains 700 of those synthetic chemicals. So they're within you. The materials that are being produced, these chemicals that are being produced. The Environmental Working Group, which is an environmental group active in the United States, does body testing for this chemical trespass stuff. And on average, they find 700. This is why you have PCBs in breast milk, for example, or flame retardants showing up in breast milk as well. So 700 chemicals, synthetic chemicals, within each human body. So within your human body, you're harboring those 700 chemicals in the back.
Who does that testing, Tom? I didn't hear it.
The Environmental Working Group is a group that has pioneered some of that testing. What's fascinating to me is that the federal government system, which is supposed to test these chemicals before they come online, they don't require synergistic testing. In other words, relationships between different chemicals. They just look at an isolated chemical itself when it's produced. And so we have no idea what's happening in the synergistic effects between different chemicals or different organic compounds in those chemicals themselves. 90% of all forests in the United States have been logged. So 90% of all the original forests in the United States are now gone. They've been logged. And the 70% is a number that scared the shit out of me when I first heard it. Other people just take it in stride. I guess we're at that point in our evolution. A study came out a couple months ago saying 70% of all biodiversity on the planet has now been extinguished. 70% of all biodiversity on the planet has now been extinguished. It's now gone. And so, which has led the United Nations, on the basis of this data and statistics, to declare a planetary catastrophe. We have now bestowed this planetary catastrophe onto you, right? Because you're the ones that are going to have to deal with it, right? This is our legacy. This is our saga. We're giving it to you as a gift. Don't bother to thank us, but that's what's landing in your lap. So the question is, in my head, which I've asked environmental law conferences and other places where I've spoken, is this. 40 years ago, the United States passed landmark environmental legislation. We passed things called the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. And all of these great sounding environmental laws that were supposed to be about cleaning this up. What's happened instead, when you look at a graph of whether things have gotten better or worse, the graph precipitously keeps falling. Things are getting worse. Things are worse now, 40 years after those major environmental laws were passed, than before. By almost every major environmental statistic, whether we look at waste, whether we look at other contaminants, whether we look at local decision making, it doesn't matter. Everything's been eroded over those 40 years. So the question is, why is that the situation? And the one thing we posit to basically change the math around in some ways is that the reason why we've ended up in this place is because those laws that were passed, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all those landmark environmental laws, had very little to do with protecting nature. That may sound strange, but they had very little to actually do with protecting nature or ecosystems. What they had to do was they were all about legalizing harm. In other words, when a state agency gives a company a permit to put in a toxic waste incinerator, where the company wants to put one in, and the state agency actually issues a permit to that corporation to do so, this state is actually legalizing that activity to take place. We think of the environmental laws as actually being protective of the environment. The corporate boys see it a little differently. They actually see the permitting process as a legalization process, to legalize something that previously had been illegal. They're not called permits for nothing. They actually permit harm to occur, harm that couldn't otherwise occur through that framework. The reason why we get booted out of conferences is because the message that we carry is not one that wants to be heard, that most folks want to hear in terms of the environmental legal community, who supposedly are using these landmark laws to protect health, safety, and welfare of communities that are faced with these types of projects. The problem is that in our experience, and we started out as a nonprofit law firm back in 1995 to do traditional environmental law, we figured out in about 6 years that the environmental legal system was not established to actually protect communities, but was instead established to allow corporations in many ways to override the communities in which they were doing business. The preeminent way to do environmental activism in the United States today is through something called the regulatory system. Now, this may all sound Greek. We're going to un-Greek it a little bit, which is, let's pretend that you're a community. Where are you from? Here. Town. Yep.
Colorado.
Colorado. What town?
Delta.
Okay. Where's Delta in relation to Denver?
Southwest.
All right. So we're in Delta, Colorado. Let's say someone wants to frack in Delta. So small town could be any municipality in the United States. We're picking on Delta. In Delta, let's say, pick a company, Chesapeake Energy, wants to conduct a fracking operation in Delta. Does everybody know what fracking is? Okay. So just the thumbnail is that fracking is a way of extracting natural gas and oil in the United States. That requires massive amounts of water. It involves injecting material into the ground to actually explode rock so that the shale gas, the natural gas and the oil is actually released so that you can then harvest it. Environmentalists and other communities are opposed to it for a number of reasons. Number one, the process of extraction contributes to climate change, which is it actually makes natural gas not a green alternative, but it actually carries climate-inducing contaminants or climate-inducing activities with it. In addition, you have to use massive amounts of water. The water after you use it and it comes back up is contaminated, so you have to get rid of it someplace. There are earthquakes that are now being caused by fracking in Ohio. So when you go underground and make the underground slippery with the proppant and the other materials to get the natural gas out, you cause slippage. And so now there are earthquakes occurring across vast regions because of the fracking operations that are going on. Let's say the folks in Delta don't want fracking to occur. It could be a number of reasons why they don't want it to occur, but they don't want it to happen within their city of Delta, their town. Is it city of Delta or town? All right, well, let's go town of Delta. So there's a community meeting in Delta. People gather at the library, and they sit around, I hope there's a library, they sit around the library, and they say to each other, we don't want this to happen. We like our town the way it is. We don't want fracking to happen. The myth in American law is that the town actually has the authority to say no to the fracking operation coming in. That may also sound strange to everyone that's grown up in the United States with the IV drip in their arm that tells us that we live in a democracy and that the founding fathers were the brightest and best people that ever trod the planet, and that the constitutional system is all about guaranteeing our right to govern ourselves. Turns out very little of that is true, and in fact the opposite is true, which I'm going to talk about tonight. But in essence, when the fracking company wants to come into the town of Delta, and the state of Colorado, which we're going to be talking about because we're in Denver tomorrow, and then in a little place called Lafayette, north of Denver, the day after, is that the state of Colorado has passed, through the legislature, something called the Oil and Gas Act. Oil and Gas Act was developed back in the 70s by the energy corporations so that they would have a regulatory system through which to do fracking and energy extraction. So what's in these state laws, these oil and gas acts? Well, there are protections for like setbacks. So if you're going to drill a fracking well, you can't do it closer than 300 feet to a person's house. You can't do it next to a stream. You can't do it next to a church in some places. In addition, the Oil and Gas Act contains a provision that preempts all localities from actually adopting something more stringent than the Oil and Gas Act itself. So when you look at this survey of different states who have oil and gas acts in place, we have to understand that the oil and gas acts are there for a reason. That companies that wanted to frack or wanted to do energy extraction came together, not in a library, but usually in the legislative halls, and actually drafted laws that govern how energy can be extracted in those particular states. So in Colorado, you have the Oil and Gas Act. Folks come together in Delta and they say, well, we don't want fracking for a number of reasons. You know, they cause earthquakes. That might be a reason. In addition to that, it's a privatization of our resource. I mean, the gas is actually in our town. It's privatizing our resource and giving it to a private company. In addition to that, you have water use, which has become a big issue. You have contamination. You have contamination of aquifers, which has now occurred in a couple states where people can't drink their water. Some folks may have seen the movie Gasland by Josh Fox, where people were lighting their faucets on fire, the water coming out, because it now contains methane because of the drilling. So they're lighting their drinking water on fire coming out of the faucet. So folks in Delta say, hey, we've got all these issues. We don't want fracking here. It's bad for us. It's a threat to our health, safety, and welfare. So the first thing somebody says usually in those meetings is, well, this is a legal issue, right? It involves the law because we want to stop it here, which means we have to make a decision or use the law in some way to stop it. Usually they pick up the phone, first thing they do is pick up the phone, and they call the state agency. So they pick up the phone and they call the state agency that's in charge of the Oil and Gas Act in this case. And the state agency will have some kind of name like the Department of Environmental Protection or the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, some nice sounding Rachel Carson-ish name that the state will have. So the first call goes into the state agency. And the state agency person will say to you, we're so happy you called. We're ecstatic that you called. Because good government means that people are involved in decision making, and we're so ecstatic that you as a interested participant within the community have called us because it's a very important issue. And we have good news, we have great news for you. We are currently examining a permit application that's been submitted by Chesapeake Energy to frack in your community. And guess what? We have even better news, which is that we have a 30-day comment window. And the 30-day comment window is still open. And in fact, if you ask us, because you're coming into the game kind of late, we'll even hold it open for another 10 days or 15 days for you if you want to put in comments to the agency, right? So the group then says, well, that's great. This gives us a place to participate, this permit application and making comments. And then they ask the state agency, well, we want to raise these issues, right? All this other stuff about earthquakes and blah, blah, blah. And the state agency says, well, we're sorry, but we can't entertain comments on those issues because we as a state agency have to follow the Oil and Gas Act. And the Oil and Gas Act only requires these setbacks and buffers and maybe some fencing issues. In other words, very narrow issues that deal with how the facility is going to be regulated. With an understanding that the word regulate automatically means that it's coming in, right? Because when you use the verb regulate, it means to regulate an ongoing operation. That's what the verb means. It means something's automatically coming in. The only thing we can tweak with is how carefully it's going to be regulated. But the activity itself is going to come in. And so that doesn't leave the group very happy. In addition, some in the group actually pick up the phone and call the corporation. Or the corporation's representatives show up at a town meeting or a governmental meeting, and they're cornered by the community group. And the folks say to them, hey, what do we need to do here? We want to make sure that your activities don't harm us in the community. And the corporation says, we're so happy you're here. We're so happy you came to the meeting because we're here to answer your questions, and we're also happy to announce that we have a permit application that's been submitted. There's a 30-day comment period for that permit. We'd like you to get involved in that. But these are very complex issues. These are very complex issues. And to actually wind your way through the permit process, you're really going to need a lawyer, right? You're going to need legal help because this isn't something that's easily understood, and people in the industry are the folks who understand it, and you need to hire a lawyer to actually participate in that process. To which the group then starts looking for legal counsel. And because lawyers in the United States are very, very expensive nowadays for environmental law, some of my peers, colleagues, are now charging $1,200 an hour to actually review permits, to draft ordinances, to give advice. It costs a $5,000 retainer just to sit down with them. Needless to say, a lot of the communities, maybe the ones in Delta, don't have the resources to pay for those types of legal services that would be offered. And so the group usually tries to find a pro bono legal assistant, somebody that's free. There's a very few number of free lawyers out there that do environmental work. We're some of them. In the United States back in the 90s, there were only 200 of them, full-time public interest environmental lawyers. That number has not changed much over the past 20 years. So there's relatively few of them running around. But let's assume the folks in Delta have some connections. What they do is they call the lawyer at the law firm. The Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, or Justice, one of the big environmental groups that provides legal counsel. And in the conversation with the lawyer says to them, as good lawyers do, giving them a list of options, they'll say, we can help you. We know the right experts to come in. We know the right way to do the permit applications, and we can actually try to get the permit application thrown out. And the community group then say, well, how are you going to do that? And the lawyer says, well, we take the corporate permit application in one hand, and we take the regulations in the other. And then we examine the permit application to see what's missing, that the regulations require to be in there, but that aren't there. And just as an example of that, we used to work on toxic waste incinerators quite a bit in Pennsylvania. So in Pennsylvania, you have to put up a bond, a road bond, because your trucks break down the roads. They beat them up. And so you have to post a bond, and the bond has to be $500,000. So that if the roads get beaten up by your trucks coming in and out of the incinerator, that the local government and the state government can pay to repair the road. So you post a bond. That's what the law requires. We would go in these situations where we would be representing a group, and we would look for gaps, omissions, and deficiencies within the permit application. So we'd have a 400-page permit application. We would go through it and figure out what's missing. So some of the corporations would only submit a $250,000 bond, right, instead of the $500,000 bond. The regulations would require the president of the corporation to sign the permit application. But lo and behold, when we looked through the application, it was the secretary of the corporation that signed it, not the president. There'd have to be a water study of some kind. And in some of those places, the water study was 30 years old. And so we would go in and we would argue to the judge, Your Honor, under section little 2, little c, little I, little Roman numeral I, little 2 of section 25 of statute 25, section 1644, that the application needed a bond of $500,000. It wasn't there. It was less than that. Or the secretary had signed it, not the president. You get the idea. You get the drift. Our job as environmental lawyers, which has been the job of environmental lawyers for 40 years now, has been to come in and actually examine these permit applications to make sure they're administratively complete. That's the term, the lingo that all the lawyers use, administratively complete. When you do that, of course, you're working under an application that was submitted under a law that was written by the very corporations that ostensibly the regulations are supposed to regulate. Okay? Let me say that again because we're packing a lot of stuff in a very short period of time. The corporate boys wrote this. They wrote it to actually accelerate extraction, to create a stable environment, a regulatory environment to extract. They're now putting in a permit application underneath this. You have a community group that wants to say no to it. In other words, to ban it or prohibit it outright, right? But they're agreeing to work under a system of permit applications that was established originally by the corporations themselves. If we actually think that the energy corporations are going to design these laws to give us an opening to say no to something coming in that the law was originally written to actually propel, we're the crazy ones. There's no wonder why these numbers are here, right? There's no wonder why things have gotten worse, because we've been hamsters running around on a wheel under somebody else's rules that were intended to actually strip us of any decision at the local level to actually say no to the things that are coming in to harm us, right? The great thing about this system is how well it works, right? And that we call it democracy, right? So you'll have people, Robert Kennedy Jr., who I've met, and other folks in the environmental legal community, they'll talk about how wonderful this system is because it's democratic. That it gives you, in Delta or wherever else you're from, the ability to actually participate, right, in this process. To participate, to be a stakeholder is the word that was developed by the corporate folks. To actually have a place to go to make your voices known. I don't know about you, but I kind of bridle when somebody says, well, all we want is a place at the table. All we want is a seat at the table. That's the language that's used by the liberal progressive community about, hey, we want to have some hand in this, we just want a seat at the table. Well, I don't know about you, but we own the fucking table, right? It's not a seat at the table we're seeking, right? That we own the table. It's our table. We get to invite people to our table. We can decide whether they get a beverage or not, or whether they get utensils, or whether we want to serve them or not, right? It's not their table. But the way that the system has been constructed is, it is completely their table, right? The comparison that we draw in the democracy school, and this is the regulatory system as it is, as it works. And this is how everything starts. When a project comes into a community, we've watched it over the past 14 years of doing this particular work, about how community groups are driven down to what we call a regulatory point, where all they can talk about are things that are pre-programmed through this structure to be talked about. Everything else is off limits. And like cattle down a chute in the place where they get the stun gun shot into their heads, that whether it's us, the good environmental lawyers on this side who are called to help, who then drive them down to this regulatory point where the bolt gun gets used, or this side, which is the corporations and the state agency, driving people down to the regulatory point. That's all just like cattle being driven down to a point where eventually the cow is slaughtered at the bottom. Because here, even if we win, we don't win much of anything at all. We win a different setback, or we win a different buffer zone, or we, in effect, are enforcing the very rules that the corporation wrote against them, right? They wrote the script, and now we find ourselves as activists and communities in a subordinate position where it's assumed that the facility is going to go in, but the best we can do is actually tinker with the regulations that the corporations wrote themselves, right? That's not at least my definition of how democracy is supposed to work, right? If communities don't want something coming into the community, they should have the power to actually say no to it. But this is where we spend a majority of our time. I can't recall, I can recall how many times we did this in the 7 years that we practiced conventional environmental law. We were the folks driving people down to this point. And eventually, we saw the point for what it was, and the system for what it was, and decided to do something different, because we didn't intend to spend our careers helping corporations build better permit applications, right? Because that's what environmental law is today, is helping corporations build better permit applications. They had a hand up in the back.
I just wanted to say that there was a fertilizer plant that went in southeast Iowa last spring, recently, and there was a lot of controversy about funding for it. And I was involved in a group of people who were trying to oppose it, and it was exactly that. The only meetings allowed for, you call them up and you're like, oh, we're so glad you called. That's exactly the words they use. you know, we're having a meeting, why don't you come? And then you go to the meeting, well, this meeting's only about the air quality. I'm sorry, we can't address any of your, no, the air quality was actually, frankly, the least of our concerns.
Right.
They are able to take, not only was the funding a ripoff for everybody in this state, but they're taking 6 million gallons of water out of the aquifers daily, and they're gonna dump it down the rivers, or sell it back to us, or whatever they wanna do with it once it's through. And the only thing we could talk about was the air quality for it. And
Yes. And if you were the company, you would do the same thing. I mean, if you had a different value system and you were the company, because the law allows them to operate in a certain way. My predecessor is a guy named Richard Grossman. He's a historian in the United States who passed away recently. He used to say, it's not what corporations do illegally that's the problem. It's what corporations do legally that's the problem. Because they have the power to structure the system to make what should be illegal legal. In other words, to change the structure of law to make it so. And unfortunately, they're back all the way back to the early days of the country in terms of how the constitutional structure is written to protect property and commerce rights over others, which is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So the question is, how far does the change have to go back? How deep does it have to go? Because your community is no different than the 500 that we've helped over the last 15 years, which is there has to be an understanding of what the problem is. Because that's the big issue. What's the problem? Is it that we don't have enough experts in the regulatory hearing? Is it that we didn't submit enough paper in the regulatory hearing? Is it that we didn't say the right things in the regulatory hearing? Well, that's not the problem. The problem is the system itself, which a woman named Jane M. Morris once said, she said the only thing that environmental regulations regulate are environmentalists. Because it's a script that makes us predictable. So when the corporate boys come in, they know what we're going to do on the opposition, and they've already planned for it. And in addition, their lawyer fees, unlike ours, are tax deductible.
So what do we do?
Right. So tax deductible under the law as a reasonable and necessary business expense, so it's all structural. So what do we do? That's the big question, right? All right, enough of the depressing stuff. We're going to take that. All right, so we know we're in a really bad place. That's basically what we know. So starting around 2000 or so, communities started seeing parts of that regulatory system for what it was. They started thinking to themselves, why bother? Why bother to engage in this? And the place where that started to happen was in Pennsylvania, where our office is in central Pennsylvania. That's Pennsylvania.
There's a little triangle.
So in Pennsylvania, you have an area called the rural T, right? In political parlance, it's called the rural T in Pennsylvania. It is rural, conservative, poor. These are the guys with the John Deere hats and the shit kicker boots. I mean, these are the folks in this area. If you run for political office in Pennsylvania and you win Philadelphia and you win Pittsburgh, there's no need to set foot in the other 62 counties in Pennsylvania because all the population is in these areas, which means that the rural T has been, for use of a better word, emasculated from a political perspective. It doesn't matter what they want. They have no political power to use. In 2000, we started getting phone calls from communities down here in the south central part of the state that were targeted for factory farms. I know these are boutique size for Iowa and other places in the Midwest, but these were 10 to 15,000 head hog factory farms. So things that we hadn't seen before. They were at a scale we hadn't seen before in the state of Pennsylvania. The communities there since the 70s, about 300 townships. We have township government in Pennsylvania. We have 1,700 townships in the state. Some of the townships, 300 of them across rural this part of Pennsylvania, had passed regulatory ordinances that essentially made it expensive to dispose of liquid manure. So these hog facilities put out massive amounts of liquid manure as waste product. And the point to these ordinances that the township had passed was to make it prohibitively expensive to dispose of the liquid manure that was being produced by those factory farms. So in the legal, they were de facto bans. So by fact, they made it too expensive to operate, and therefore factory farms stayed out. There was a big hubbub in South Carolina and North Carolina during those years where the hurricane came through and uncapped all the manure lagoons in the state, and you had these pictures in the nightly news of the hogs with all four legs in the air going off the coast, creating a dead zone off the coast of South Carolina. The legislatures imposed a temporary moratorium on new factory farms. The corporations began to move. These are, Smithfield Foods Corporation, Hatfield Foods Corporation, the 4 companies that control 80% of pork production in the United States today. They began to migrate, and they wanted to come into PA for a number of reasons. Number one is proximity to DC and other major metropolitan areas to ship stuff to, in addition to the economic climate that prior governors had set up in the state from a tax perspective. And so they began coming in. The problem is when they came in, they met these things, the 300 local ordinances. And so instead of going into those communities and trying to change one by one, they do what the corporate boys have learned how to do well over the last 100 years, which is they went to the legislature. And they drafted a bill called the Nutrient Management Act. Sounds good. What did the Nutrient Management Act do? Well, same thing that the Colorado Oil and Gas Act does. It said we're going to set a planning process for, if you want to put in a factory farm, you have to submit a plan to the state that says this is how we're going to deal with our manure, and this is the orderly process we're going to have for operation, those types of things. Within the Nutrient Management Act, making it a state issue, factory farm is a state issue, was a preemption clause, which actually took out all 300 ordinances that have been passed in South Central PA. It gutted them. So it said, even if you have one on the books, you shall not be able to enforce it. So it was the state legislature acting at the behest of the agribusiness corporations to preempt or nullify all 300 of those ordinances that had previously operated. People in those communities were shocked. They said, well, how is this possible? I thought we lived in a democracy. And basically started screaming at their local government officials, saying, well, you need to protect us, and the governmental officials saying there's nothing we can do. The local lawyers who the elected officials were turning to, the elected officials said, well, wait a minute, how is this fair? The agribusiness corporations wanted to come in, they wrote a law, they preempted us. It doesn't seem quite right. There's something wrong in the way that this happened. And the lawyer would say, well, I can't help it. It's well settled law that the state can preempt the local, which we're going to talk about in a couple minutes as well. That the state can preempt the local from doing anything that you want, including saying no to certain things. These guys here, mostly farming communities, then start to call us. And they called us at an opportune moment when we were closing down our office because we didn't want to be lawyers anymore. We wanted to do something else that actually mattered. And when the calls started coming in, we heard something different from these folks. It used to be that the call would come in like the regulatory triangle, and they would say, we want your help with dealing with this permit that's being issued for X, Y, and Z. And we would say to them, well, okay, we're more than happy to help. We'll do the experts, we'll do the testimony, we'll go in front of the judge, all that kind of stuff. In these cases, these folks started calling us, and they would say things like, we want to stop this factory farm from coming in. And we would say, well, that's great, but you can't say no to the factory farm coming in, because if you attempt to say no, that you will get sued. So the corporation that wants to put the factory farm in will sue you. And they'll sue your community for violating the corporation's constitutional rights. Okay? So corporations in the United States today have constitutional rights. It's by virtue of about 150 years of different Supreme Court decisions. It's embedded in the constitutional structure. But corporations have been deemed to be persons, like you or I. So Walmart has First Amendment rights. Smithfield Foods Corporation has Fifth Amendment rights. All the Bill of Rights stuff that accrues to us as natural breathing persons is now also held by corporate entities. So corporations in the United States have rights. You may say, why does that matter? How does it matter? Well, we'll get into that in a second. But suffice it to say that when we said to these folks, well, you can't say no, for 10 years we were telling people that they couldn't say no because of the way the permit process was set up, that people would say, oh, okay, well, we want to do the permit stuff to try to slow it down or delay it somehow. These folks coming out of central Pennsylvania said, we don't want it. And I would say, well, you're going to get sued. And they would say, we don't care. All right, there was a shift of some kind happening in about that time period. And I said, well, you realize that if you pass this, you can get sued. And they would say, why? And we would say, well, it's because corporations have constitutional rights. And they would say, why? And I'd say, well, it's 150 years of court decisions and in which the corporations have said the corporations are persons and this right and that right. And they would say, why? And we'd say, well, the constitutional structure is such that it gives certain rights to property and commerce, and corporations are the biggest economic actors that do property and commerce, have property and drive commerce, and so therefore it's protected them. To which they would say, why? And we would say, well, it has something to do with English common law. back to 1066, and the fact the U.S. Constitution actually embeds English common law into the constitutional structure. And English common law was all about property rights. It was actually about big P, property rights, over the rights of people, communities, and nature. And they would say, why? And we'd say, we have no idea. And that's basically where the conversation would end. But all to say, there were folks there that wanted to go deeper. They wanted to go upstream, to actually find out who was putting the babies in. There's this old metaphor, this old narrative, where the environmental organization, the environmental movement has been about standing at the river's edge, and you see a baby coming down, and the hikers and the backpackers that are there, they jump into the river because you got to get the baby out, you got to pull the baby out. And so they're pulling the baby out of the river, and then another one's coming down. And then we got to get that baby out too, and you got to pull the baby out. Pretty soon there's 10 and 20 and 30 babies coming down. It's all the bad environmental stuff's happening. You got to get in. Pretty soon it's all you're doing is you're pulling babies out. And one of the hikers looks up on the river edge, and one of his companions has actually put his pack on, and he's walking away. And the guy said, "Where are you going?" He goes, "I'm going to go upstream and stop whoever's putting the babies in the first place." Right? But as a community, we've been unable to do that, mostly because we're all locked down, and we're very obedient to the system that is, because even our friends talk about it as a democracy and as a democratic system. And so these were folks willing to go upstream. And so we started to work with them. What did we work with them to do? Well, first we drafted a series of laws called anti-corporate farming laws. Because folks were beginning to say, well, the problem is not the factory farm itself that wants to come in. The problem is that 4 corporations control 80% of pork production in the United States and have decided that we're going to have these vertically integrated concentrated animal feeding operations, these factory farms. And so the problem seems to be deeper than just the factory farm itself. The problem is a system that has corporatized agriculture. And so we said to them, okay, well, if that's the system that needs to be fixed, then let's look at other folks who've tried to fix it. It turns out in the Midwest, including Iowa, there are 9 Midwestern states that have pioneered the development of these anti-corporate farming laws, which were passed in Oklahoma way back in 1904 as a way to get corporations out of farming. They essentially banned corporations, other than family farm corporations, smaller corporations, from engaging in farming activities. That means engaging in contract relationships with lawyers to raise hogs for them. It means directly buying farms. It means doing all those kinds of things. When we learned about these from you guys, from your area, your region, we were very excited. So we stole them. And we took these and we actually turned them into local ordinances that could then be adopted by municipalities in Pennsylvania. So in other words, they lost the regulatory stuff. How do we come back stronger and better? How do we up the ante in some ways to do this? Pretty soon those laws traveled out to different parts of PA. And in addition to those laws, we also had another situation arise which dealt with sewage sludge. It's a good thing it's after lunch, but what's sewage sludge? Well, it's everything that comes out of a centralized sewage treatment system. So it can be hospital waste, it can be your normal residential waste. In the United States, 70% of all sewage sludge that we produce from centralized sewage treatment systems is dumped on land. It's actually used to grow food. So we take the waste from the sewage treatment plants, we separate out the solid from the liquid, we discharge the liquid into a tributary, and then we take the solid and we actually apply it to cropland where we grow food. What's in the stuff can contain over 80,000 different toxic contaminants. So it's anything that goes down a drain or down the toilet and passes through that filtration or that process and system. And so there were communities that were faced with sludging. And guess what? 4 corporations control 70% of the sludge market in the United States. Waste Management Corporation used to be the largest hauler of sludge, making money by hauling it from the sewage treatment plants to farmers where they would give it away for free. And just to show you how everything's connected, Waste Management Corporation was bought about a year ago by the Carlyle Group. Carlyle Group is, of course, nefarious for other things besides sludge. But anyway, it's all together there. So the sludge stuff, why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because sludge was defined as a nutrient under the Nutrient Management Act. They were preempted as much as the factory farm folks were by the new law. They, too, ran into the new law. They, too, came to us. We drafted an anti-corporate sludging ordinance, essentially defining sludging as farming and banning corporations from engaging in it. And pretty soon we had 89 municipalities dealing with sludge, and we had 14 dealing with corporate farming in the state. Rural townships in Pennsylvania are about 1,000, so about 10% of rural municipalities in the state have passed those laws. The laws have since grown. They've spread outside of Pennsylvania into other places, into New Hampshire, where communities have taken on Nestle and other water corporations who want to pump water from the aquifers. It's traveled into Oregon, where folks are taking on genetically modified seeds and organisms to ban them within the community. We're now active in 24 states, and the ordinances are basically the front line of the work. Now, the ordinances, if everybody's been listening, are actually about putting forward a different system of law in which communities can say no. You have another system of law, the current one that operates, that says communities can't say no. So there's a conflict between the two. When communities actually begin to move on this front, which is more or less about a revolt. I mean, we're talking about it in very sane, level-headed terms, but it's essentially a revolt. It's a revolt by communities who say we're not going to be subjected to corporate control anymore. We want to make our own decisions about what happens in our community. That when you start doing this work, because you're jumping out of the regulatory stuff and into a different environment, that you end up in a place where you get attacked by different things. The system is set up to stop you from doing what these communities are doing now, about 160 of them across the United States. In essence, today, your community, and this can be seen as a geographic community, so a municipality. Let's use Delta again. Delta, Colorado, is in a box. And you're in a box because on all four corners, all four edges of the box, you have forces that operate on you to control what you can do. So on one side is corporate constitutional rights, corporate personhood rights. And again, what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that a corporation has attributes of personhood. So First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights, Fifth Amendment rights, that they can actually use to sue the community if the community violates those rights. You then have non-personhood rights, like Commerce Clause rights. In the US Constitution, we have a Commerce Clause, which in essence creates a private right of action for corporations to sue communities for anything that interferes with interstate commerce. Like fracking interferes with interstate commerce, or corporate hog production interferes with interstate commerce. In addition to that, you have our old friend preemption, which, as the lawyers like to say, bless you, the federal preempts the state preempts the local. It's like this easy red letter rule that issued to all lawyers on the first day that you go to law school. So well-settled law that the federal trumps the state and the state trumps the local. So if there's preemption like the Colorado Oil and Gas Act, it trumps what you can do, right? And then on this side is, bless you, is a little nasty thing called Dillon's rule. I want to say that you guys produced Mr. Dillon. I'm not sure that's true.
Kansas.
Oh, it's Kansas. Oh, it was Iowa Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Dillon was a railroad lawyer, and he came up with this rule that's now been adopted by the U.S. Supreme Court. And that rule says that your municipality can't pass anything that hasn't been explicitly authorized by the state to be passed. So in other words, you have no general power of self-governance. The only power that you have are the ones that the state chooses to give you, right? So if the state hasn't chosen to give you the power, you don't have it. That's what Dillon's rule is all about. Iowa is a Dillon's rule state, so welcome to Iowa. So what's the problem with these four doctrines? Well, the fact they exist at all, first of all. But the second reason is that they're all privately enforceable. So let's say Delta passes a fracking law that bans fracking within Delta. What happens next? Chesapeake Energy sues. They sue the community of Delta, the municipal corporation itself, the municipality. And there's 4 counts generally, simplifying everything, to their complaint. The first one is, you can't pass that fracking law because you violated our personhood rights. You've taken our property in violation of the Fifth Amendment. Fifth Amendment says if you have property taken by government, you have to be compensated for it. So they're saying to Delta, you haven't compensated us for the cost of the lost gas that we have lost as a result of your ban. And therefore you owe us money in the amount that we would recover from drilling the gas. That's the Fifth Amendment complaint that they would run. In addition, they'll say, well, fracking is energy related, energy is national, therefore it interferes with the Commerce Clause, and we have privately enforceable Commerce Clause rights. In addition, the state has not told you that you can pass a ban on fracking. They have not authorized you to pass a ban on fracking. And so we, Chesapeake Energy, are suing you because you violated Dillon's rule. And finally, we're suing you because you don't have the power to adopt an anti-fracking law, because the State Oil and Gas Act is the preeminent act. It actually allows that fracking to take place, and you can't do anything different because you're subordinate to the state. Okay? So it's the last piece here, and then I'm going to shut up. But the fact is that these doctrines are what enable the corporation to do what it does. Right? The corporation is not the problem. Chesapeake Energy is not the problem. The corporation that's in front of you is not the problem. The problem is the structure and system of law that guarantees that you're going to get fracked. That's the problem. It's the structure, right? And this year it's fracking, next year it's snacking, the year after that it's flacking, and then it's gracking. They change what it's called, right? And every year, when they come back with something new, we have to put our lives on hold in the community level to actually fight something new. And we fight it within the regulatory process, which is a perfect recipe for exhausting ourselves and actually our groups collapsing and not doing anything ever again. And that's its intent. That's its intent. It's what it's intended to do. It's not broken. People used to come up to us and say, well, the regulatory system is broken. And we'd say, it's not broken at all. It's working perfectly. Because its goal is not to protect health, safety, and welfare. Its goal is actually to allow this stuff to happen. And so our gig has been, let's look beyond the single harm. Let's look beyond the factory farm. Let's look beyond the corporation. Let's begin talking about a system of law that actually enables the corporation to do what it does. And in fact, the corporation isn't the problem either. It's the people behind the corporation who are now shielded by the corporation when they attempt to do things. So in essence, we have a structure of law that's specially calculated to give privileges to a minority of people who are running the corporations and give them more rights than the community itself. It doesn't matter what the 10,000 people in Delta want, or however many people, 30. It doesn't matter what they want in the community, because they have no legal authority to actually get it. This is democracy today, right? This is what it looks like. This is the face of it. And the big question to you guys is, can we actually attain sustainability? Right? This whole building and the whole program. Can we actually attain economic and environmental sustainability when we are stuck in this box where folks with unsustainable goals, unsustainable activities, who are coming into your community to drill you, to extract you, to burn you, to do whatever else their interest is in your place where you live, when those corporations have more rights than you do to decide what happens in the community? Can we ever attain sustainability? That's the question, the million-dollar question. A lot of folks have said, no, we can't. And so we need to take out these doctrines. We actually need to remove them. Well, how do we remove them? Do we write a letter to Congress? I mean, won't Obama say, yeah, we're going to change those by Thursday. Thank you for bringing it to our attention that this is the way the system works. Or maybe I should write an op-ed that says, hey, this is really bad because this is how the system works. Well, you can try all those things, but our activism has been marked by those types of pressure politics activities, and it certainly hasn't stopped the list of nasties that I put up earlier. In fact, they've gotten worse. So how do you build something that changes the structure itself? How do you actually change the face of how the law operates in the United States to liberate communities to actually decide for themselves what they look like in 20, 40, or 60 years, rather than giving the power to these other entities that have absolutely no interest in making your community sustainable, right? That's the question. And because we're stuck here, right, because this is what is, folks of my ilk, my colleagues who go out in the liberal progressive communities and give speeches about sustainability, it's all bullshit. And it's bullshit because until you figure out your way out of this maze, it doesn't matter what we want, right? We can buy all the Priuses we want, and we can change all the light bulbs we want, we can take shorter showers, and we can do all those things that people talk about, but it's not going to mean an iota of difference until we figure out collectively how we take our vision and actually make it real. Because right now there are competing visions, and they've won. The war is over. It's done, right? We are on the receiving end of it. And until we figure out how to get out of this mess, we're cooked. I mean, we're done. The only question is how fast the accelerators match to the floor as we go off the cliff, backwards in some ways. And so our work has been devoted to this. What's exciting to me when I get up in the morning is that there are 160 communities in 8 states who have actually begun to pass local laws that challenge each one of these doctrines, that actually nullify corporate rights within their community, that actually opt out of Dillon's rule at the local level. They say, we're not going to obey Dillon's rule. We have a right to local self-government here. We don't recognize that doctrine. That don't recognize preemption, right? Facial, direct confrontation with the corporate boys when they come in to say those doctrines that you're using, they won't work here. We don't recognize them here. To which people say, well, that's not going to work. They're a locality, and the state and federal power is going to crush down on them. Yes, there's going to be 1,000 lawsuits and 10,000 lawsuits. And that's what's needed. Because right now, this system is not challenged. All the activist communities and all the environmental lawyers, they all validate this by working within the regulatory system. They validate this on a daily basis, right? Until you actually draw the conflict, there's no reason to change the law. It's the way law changes in the United States. It's what the abolitionists knew. It's what the suffragists knew. It's what the populist farmers of North Texas knew. It's what people know in terms of building a real movement to change the structure or paradigm itself. Otherwise, we're cooked. So these 160 communities are now beginning to write mini constitutions. We call them ordinances or charter amendments or whatever, but they're not those things really. They're new blueprints of law, with an understanding that when enough of them write enough new blueprints, that they're going to push upwards to begin to change state and federal constitutions. And a part of that blueprint, and I know we're running out of time here, I should shut up, is the rights of nature stuff, which, amazingly enough, came out of rural conservative Pennsylvania, the chick kicker boats, boots, and John Deere hat, who began to say to themselves, well, part of the reason why this system functions the way it does is because corporations have personhood rights, and they're making the allegation that their property has been interfered with by the city of Delta or by any other municipality. In essence, because under our Western system of law, and this is the furthest out that we go, nature is not recognized as having rights. Ecosystems do not have any rights under a Western system of law. They're property. So you own an ecosystem. That also may sound strange, but if you have a deed to a 10-acre piece of land, that deed carries with it the authority to you to actually destroy the ecosystem on that piece of land. It's one of the bundle of rights that comes with property ownership. You can destroy what you own. That's part of the bundle of rights that you have. What that means, of course, is that anyone who owns the most nature as property can destroy the most ecosystems, right? I don't know how to put it any plainer than that. But when nature is property, the ones that control the most nature are the ones that can destroy the most nature, right? This is completely a Western construct of law, right? It's English common law stuff. It's the stuff that was developed by our predecessors in the United States, by other systems of law. Indigenous communities have never seen nature as property. Nature has always been something different than property. It hasn't been something that was owned, in other words. It's been a different concept in indigenous communities. I have to say I was floored when I learned that when the United States wanted to create reservations for some of the tribes, in other words, give them a piece of land, that they had no collective way to actually receive ownership of the reservation land. So the U.S. government forced them to incorporate, to actually create tribal corporations to receive title for the land because the tribes had no concept of what property was when it came to ecosystems, all right? So just to show the clash of those two areas. What's amazing to me is that this concept is now being revived. This concept that ecosystems must be rights-bearing. Because environmental laws today don't recognize the rights of nature, they don't recognize ecosystems as having rights. They only see our exploitation of the ecosystem as the thing to be remedied by the courts. The example I used over lunch was that if I'm a fisherman and I fish at a local river and I catch 2 fish a day or a week, and then the river is polluted and I go into court because I've been deprived of my right to fish in the river, what the judge does is calculate the amount of damages that has been occurred, that you've suffered. So in other words, the value of 2 fish a week. He calls up the fish market, finds out how much 2 fish a week are worth, and then he recovers or makes you whole by granting you the value of the fish that you wouldn't be able to fish because the river is now polluted. The river does not appear in court. The river is not seen by the judiciary. It's not seen by the legal system because nature is property only. It's not seen in the eyes of any of our institutions. What the rights of nature movement is about is actually recognizing the ecosystems have rights of their own and can actually be defended in those rights by people that live within the communities. The rights of nature stuff began in a little community called Tamaqua Borough in south central PA. It has since spread to different states. It's now part of our standard ordinance package. And then in 2008, we got a call from the Ecuadorian Constitutional Convention. In Ecuador, folks are putting together a new constitution. They had elected a constitutional convention to do that of people from across the country. They had heard about communities in Pennsylvania. Talk about how small the world is. They had heard about communities in Pennsylvania. They wanted us to come down and share the story with them and then attempt to replicate what those communities had done at the national level in Ecuador. Thus taking Ecuador from being a regulatory-based environmental protection system to being a rights-based environmental protection system, to become the first country ever in the globe. And so we sat down, told our stories, helped them draft out the language, and eventually what happened was a rights of nature plank within the Ecuadorian constitution, which was then ratified by 70% of the public in 2008. Those rights of nature provisions have now given birth to 4 test cases. And the first case was the most interesting one, I think. The law allows ecosystems to bring suits as plaintiffs. So in the province of Loja, which is south central part of Ecuador, the local government was dumping gravel into the Vilcabamba River. So it happens all the time, right? They dump gravel and it was changing the course of the river with a lot of road construction waste that was going to the river. A couple who lived near the river took the rights of nature provisions and gave birth to a case that's now known as the Vilcabamba River versus the province of Loja. So it's actually nature and ecosystems as the plaintiff, right? Not an individual person seeking to exploit their interest in the river, but the river itself as the plaintiff. And the judge ruled in favor of the river and ordered restoration of the river from the province. There's now been 3 other cases, including use of the rights of nature provisions by the country of Ecuador to stop illegal gold mining in portions of the country. And so the rights of nature stuff is not only passed, it's actually being used. It's the only place where it's being used right now. But that's an example of how the chemistry changes when you start looking at things in a different way. The question about sustainability is, again, can we ever become sustainable if nature is property under the system of law? That's the other question that pops up, and whether they have to be a part of that. Anyway, to the end. The end is, the kind of what do we do now kind of stuff, is that in the 8 states where we are relatively intensively focused, where we have staff people, where we have lawyers supporting the work, those types of things, there's starting to be a working upwards, which is happening. Because eventually what we're talking about is federal constitutional change. There's nothing short of that that's actually going to change most of those doctrines. Keeping in mind, corporate constitutional rights here, those are federal. So those are federally anchored by the federal constitution. Preemption is state-based, Dillon's rule is state-based, Commerce Clause stuff is federal-based. So some of the stuff, if you're organizing, can be pushed from the bottom into the state level to get rid of some of these things. The other stuff has to be pushed to the federal level. What we're seeing now is these communities across the U.S., and eventually there has to be 10,000 of them, and hopefully Fairfield will become one, Bob, in a minute. That these folks at the bottom, these communities that we've been helping and assisting and catalyzing, will eventually push upwards to make state constitutional change. And that's starting to happen now. We have 8 community rights networks that have arisen at the community level to actually begin pushing for state change and driving state change, and that would liberate the communities from some of the state doctrines that are active. It's important to remember that some mornings I wake up, I'm amazed anything's happening at all, right? Because the force of law is so powerful here in terms of confining us in a place. it's actually kind of amazing anybody's doing anything at all other than giving up, because that's pretty much the place where we are. So these folks are driving state change. Eventually, next year is the plan, we're gonna have the first federal constitutional gathering, which is intended to envision what federal constitutional changes would need to look like to actually drive sustainability into the Constitution. So it's almost about talking about what does a sustainability constitution look like? Instead of one that's about extraction and exploitation and property and commerce, what does one look like that's actually about sustainability? What we need to survive on the planet. How do we build a system of law that parallels what we need in terms of sustainability? And so the good news is it's the beginning of the beginning of the beginning, which is all this stuff, we don't even call it a movement yet. It's disparate people in disparate places trying to come into grips with that thing and how to change that. So there's bad news and there's good news. The bad news is it's the beginning of the beginning of the beginning, so anything goes. And the good news is that folks that have gotten involved are at the ground level, so it becomes a blueprint for what they want as they move through the system. But that's those are the cliff notes for how the thing is moving. Yeah.
Will this become a pendulum issue?
Pendulum? I don't know what that means.
It's swinging too far in the other direction.
Well, it's swinging too far over there now 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So I'd be happy if it swung our way 25% of the time. It's the easiest way. So.
Corporations have the American Legislative Exchange Council.
Yep, ALEC.
Yeah. Is there any polar opposite?
Right now, that's us. In the small way that we actually operate. I mean, ALEC is this massive national organization which the corporations support, but it feeds legislation, state legislators to do X, Y, and Z. There's really no counterpart to them. I mean, we provide a small role with the local and state stuff that we've worked on, but there's nothing really there on the other side.
How do we get involved?
Well, it means getting involved where you live. And so it means Fairfield and Jefferson County and actually doing it here. I mean, that's, part of I've been here twice. I've taught a democracy school 8-9 months ago, and some people have been gestating on that stuff about what needs to happen. I think Sustainability Bill of Rights for the city of Fairfield would be a first, something that would actually envision how to change the law to bring it into alignment with sustainability principles. That's just the thing off the top of my head, but it has to happen here. It has to happen everywhere. And so there's groups in Decorah now working as well. So in Iowa, we start seeing a movement towards this stuff. And so the question is how to make way for it at the state level.
What's the strategic plan for next year when this movement becomes really noticed and corporate America spends billions of dollars to make them look right and what we're trying to do wrong? What's the plan for that?
You hope that they do. Because the ordinance, that may sound strange, but the ordinances and strategic vehicles, the lawmaking vehicles, are actually written to be challenged. They actually incorporate the challenge into them. Because to bring a suit on these grounds actually points out these various doctrines more. In other words, we live in a country where all of this is camouflaged.
Right.
And it's a myth, we think we live in a place where we have self-government. All this, the way that the system actually functions is all camouflaged. There's a very small percentage of people who actually understand how it works.
Right.
This work is done on the faith that if you build the vehicle and then invite the challenge, kind of like pulling the tail on a tiger, that the challenge comes in a jiu-jitsu way that actually reveals how the system operates. It's about using their energy against them, which is why we've had 160 of these, only 4 have been challenged. And because the corporate boys, they know that we're trying to get them into a fight that they don't particularly want. They like the fights over parts per million and the regulatory stuff. They're okay with those. They know how to win them. On these, it's rights versus rights. It actually reframes the battle. That it's not about the single issue, it's about decision-making rights. And so the key is how do we use this to roll into a whole new era of local lawmaking that's actually going to give birth to those deeper changes. And in some places, if you have an ordinance, which we've been working on, corporation comes in, tries to strike the ordinance, you have options to go home rule. So in other words, up the ante instead of going home and write a new constitution for the locality. City of Fairfield, you have an opportunity to do home rule option in the city, which would allow you to actually write a new constitution within Fairfield. And there's a lot of hoops to go through from start to finish on that, but you have the option at least to do it.
I heard with fracking that even if you own your land, corporations can buy the mineral rights.
Yes.
And so how do you even bypass that?
Well, you bypass it by not recognizing it. I mean, otherwise your only choice is to say, okay, extract. So what you're talking about is subsurface mineral rights. So it used to be illegal to separate out the estate from the subsurface and the surface. And what happened, this is the history to your question that we need to understand to answer it, is that in West Virginia, the corporate boys, the coal boys, who've been at work there for much longer than the fracking boys in most places have been, they came up with a new law that actually legalized the separation of the surface and subsurface rights.
State law?
A state law. So they didn't have to purchase the surface property, that they could just purchase the subsurface property. And so they segmented the estate, which up to then was illegal. And then other states followed by actually legalizing the surface-subsurface separation. So now you have a landowner on the surface, and then you have a company that owns the subsurface rights. We've been writing the ordinances to actually get at the subsurface rights as well as the surface stuff. In other words, grab authority over both at that level.
Well, how can we find out if our state is part of this and how we can own our own?
Well, I can tell you it is. And the only way to find out if you sold your subsurface rights, because they could have been sold before you come into possession of your property, is whether the deed says it. So when you do a deed search at the county courthouse, you will see either an easement or a contract, which actually has given the subsurface rights away.
So it is in the deed, because I thought.
Yes, it's an attachment to the deed, because it can't, the land can't be sold without an acknowledgement that that restriction is there.
Anybody else? Any other questions? You want to explore this more tonight, you come to Tom's talk tonight, and Tom, can you say a little bit about what you're going to be, what's going to be different about tonight?
Well, because most people start off at the same place, which is knowing very little of this stuff, we usually give a somewhat repeat of the story about where we started and how we got involved in the stuff. And then probably more of a focus on the rights of nature, which we covered in 2 minutes here, but talking more about what that actually means in terms of practice.
Is there a website we can go to follow your mission?
Yeah, our website is celdef.org. And like I said, not much has happened in Iowa at this point, but there are some clumps beginning to come together. Bob, did you want to say something?
We're, with the help of Thomas, in the meetings we had yesterday, there's an action plan that's starting to coalesce, which Tom will announce for us tonight, which will allow us to move forward here locally after Thomas goes on to other locations, including Australia. And one of the key elements of this plan will be that we'll be forming a sustainability government committee to deal with the challenge that Thomas outlined of taking Fairfield from its existing charter of government to a new charter based on home rule, which is legal in Iowa. So as this unfolds, we'll be looking for everybody and anybody who's interested to join the committee and help create that process. So I hope that all of you who are interested will attend tonight and join our committee.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so, you stay here, everybody who's, does their afternoon meditation in class, sit down. It's cool to see you. Have a good day.